Hi, everyone. I'm still very much from Cluj and Clujanka așa 100%. So I don't just have a soft spot for the city, it's my home and will probably always be. Thank you for the opening and thank you for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here together with my friend Gentry. I wrote a little introduction for him because he refused to write one himself. So let's see how he will respond to this. Gentry is first and foremost a friend and one of the best I've been given the chance to have. Before being my friend, Gentry worked at IDEO for many years, where he led the knowledge-sharing domain. After that, he founded Orchestra, which later became Mailbox, which was famously acquired by Dropbox. But the most important thing to know about Gentry is that he is a structured creative, taking inspiration from all aspects of life to imagine the products of tomorrow. How was that?
Beautiful.
Anything to add?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Okay, so before we go into discussing product and kind of the main topic of today, I wanted to tell the audience a bit more about your personal story and how you became and earned the title of entrepreneur.
I think entrepreneur is something that that's wired into us. It's a way of seeing the world where you simply are unwilling to accept things as they are and have this maybe foolish idea that you can actually change them. And sometimes as entrepreneurs we succeed in that, and other times we fail. But always at the core is a hunger for making things different than they are. I remember when I was a kid, I worked for my father. He ran a shopping center, so a place in Texas where I grew up, where we go to stores and just buy normal stuff. And I worked.
Yeah, we know what shopping centers are. Thanks.
You're welcome. My job was to help with the maintenance, and in Texas, it gets very hot in the summer. And I think one day, as I was helping put some tar on a roof that was leaking, after having cleaned up vomit and mowed a lawn at the hefty sum of $5 an hour, I remember thinking, there's got to be a better way to make money than this. And that took me down a road of learning how to program, actually. I started playing with electronics, fixing VCRs and stereos for people in my neighborhood. And that slowly evolved to helping people set up their computers and then get on this crazy thing called the internet. And it took me down a long road that I guess I'm still on. But it began with that moment of baking in a Texas sun and asking the question, is this really the best way for me to make money, or is there some way I can approach this differently? And I think that's the kernel at its core of an entrepreneur. You ask that question about whether something could be better than it is, and then you have the audacity to go and try and change it.
Do you think that going to Stanford helped? There's a lot of myths about Stanford being the entrepreneurship university, or maybe they're truths, so what do you think?
For me, Stanford was a very important part of becoming a more whole person. Texas, I think, was where I learned to fix things myself. And if there's an attitude there that if something's broken, it's like that cowboy spirit. You don't whine about it. You roll up your sleeves and get to work. And you do it without too much concern about whether or not you'll be successful. I think what happened with Stanford is I got exposed to a much broader world of expertise and interests and cultures and values. I began to understand that there was a lot of ways of seeing the world, not just the ones that I had grown up with, which can be very challenging. But I think it's very important, particularly if you want to do something like design, where your job is to take on the perspectives of others. And the other thing about Stanford that was, I think, unusual and very valuable is it's centered in this Silicon Valley culture that is inherently collaborative, not competitive. One way I think about that is, Stanford and Harvard are often seen as these two pinnacles of education. I'm not so sure education in and of itself is as important as it used to be in that higher academic sense. But at Harvard, you have this attitude of everyone's trying to compete with one another to demonstrate how they're the best in their particular field. And it seems to be part of a culture where there's not enough seats at the table, so to speak. And so one is always positioning against their colleagues to try and make sure they're the person that gets the seat when it appears. In California, there's no sense of limits in that way. It's just as possible for me to be successful as for you to be successful. And there's nothing about my success that's going to inhibit yours, quite the contrary. And so we begin to understand that it's by helping one another that we become better and that we can be more powerful and more capable of creation than we would on our own. That shift of seeing everyone around you as an opportunity to be more, as opposed to something that you have to cut down on your own way to the top, that is, it's a very special thing. I don't know that it exists in a lot of other parts of the world. Certainly transformed my own sense of how to operate in the world. And it's one of the reasons I like calling that part of the world home.
Well, you sort of brought this up. I wanted to ask you about it. It's a big topic outside of Silicon Valley, whether you can replicate Silicon Valley. And I think in many ways, Transylvania is trying to do the same, especially here in Cluj. I told you there's a lot of technology here, a lot of really amazing engineers. And so what do you think? Do you think you can replicate it? And if so, how?
I think in certain ways, pieces of it are already being replicated. You can see, for example, if you go into Amsterdam, there's a culture there of a similar kind of iconoclastic attention to design. There's this humor and this sort of laid-back sense of people helping one another. In Austin, Texas, there's quite a bit emerging. I think the challenge is that you have to get not just one or two things to work. You have to get a whole stack of them at once. You need a critical mass of talented people. You need a culture that values cooperation over competition. You need access to capital. You need mechanisms for education. You need that Adam Smith invisible hand, the kind of trust implicit in a market system where you're not worried about corruption, and you're not worried about getting chopped down if you grow too high. Some of my friends are Kiwi, and there's a.
By the way, that's a fruit here.
It's a food in the States too, but I'm referring to they're from New Zealand, yeah. Right. And it's a very similar culture to California in a lot of ways, but they have something there called tallest poppy syndrome. And this is an idea that if you stand out a little bit above the people around you, someone's going to lop your head off. That's a big little detail. Yeah. It means you don't try because there's inherently no reward in doing so. I think one of the nice things about California or the Silicon Valley culture is when people do crazy things, it's celebrated. Often it's celebrated even if it's a failure, just for the audacity to try.
You don't think people silently judge failure in Silicon Valley?
I'm sure that it happens. But I think the most important question is to ask what that dominant culture is. What is it that you hear, that you feel? What's the narrative, the story that's moving around you that you feel like it's almost an invitation to you to become a part of? And the invitation in that culture is to invent. It's to be bold. It's to take chances. It's to take risks. And not to worry too much about whether or not they're going to work out, but to just go for it. And I'm certain that there are lots of people trying to cut it down still, but that's not where you land. You land in this place of saying, I've got an idea, and you know what? Let's try it. And I think that's really important. It's where a lot of my courage and every other entrepreneur's courage in that part of the world comes from. It's sort of a collective. Yeah.
One of the biggest shocks for me was how failure was approached in Silicon Valley as opposed to here. I think there's just insane fear here that if you fail, it means you're somehow branded forever as a failure. And that somehow that means something about you, something that, so there may be something wrong about you or something like that. And failure is hard, even if you're in Silicon Valley.
It is hard.
Have you failed at anything?
Quite a bit.
In life?
Yeah. IDEO, the design firm where I had a chance to work for about 4 years, there's a guy there who started it named David Kelly. Very, very brilliant man. He's kind of a centerpiece of this emergent culture of the Valley. He helped Apple, or his team helped Apple create some of the earliest parts of the Mac, and they were deeply involved in a lot of the early work that was kind of spreading throughout Silicon Valley, but also in the attitudes of the small firms that were rising up there. He has this saying that you fail early and often to succeed faster. That concept that failure is an essential piece of a success, That while it might look like to the outside world that if you get to success, you somehow knew what you were doing, almost invariably, what actually happened is you set up a mechanism to allow you to try over and over and over again, trying to solve the same problem. You start out with an assumption. There's this kind of naivete that takes us into any problem we're going to solve, where we think, oh, this is going to be simple. And once we fix this, the world's going to be so much better. And then you get in there and you start to understand the problem, and your solutions don't work, or they halfway work, or they work only 5% of the time.
Yep.
And you have to set up processes that actually anticipate that, and that try and reduce that cost as much as possible. Thomas Edison, the very famous inventor of the light bulb, he has this quote that the best measure of success is the number of experiments that can be crammed into a 24-hour period. I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. When you're doing something from nothing, going from 0 to 1, you're never going to get it right the first time. In fact, if you get it right at all, it's because you got very good at failing.
Or very lucky.
Or very lucky.
Ah, come on, we've both seen people like that. Yeah. But talking about luck, from the outside, Mailbox looked like a lot of luck.
Yeah, I think Mailbox is a good example of that. On the surface, it looked like we had an idea and we executed on it in a pretty straightforward way, and from nothing to an acquired company over the matter of weeks.
From the outside, it looked like you had a great PR company.
Yeah. And in fact, we had nothing but a group of people that were desperately trying to solve a problem, and we'd been at it for 2.5 years. We started our company, it was called Orchestra at the time, based on this idea that almost everybody used email as this kind of terrible to-do list, that everybody felt overwhelmed by email. Everybody had stuff that they were supposed to do trapped in their inboxes, and a kind of guilt because as it got pushed down the list, balls got dropped. And this universal feeling of frustration at an emotional level equated to losses of productivity and inefficiency in work. And it seemed like if you could solve that problem, you'd be making a pretty big impact. We attempted to solve that by building a social to-do list. We built a product called Orchestra, and it was a very clean, I would say even beautiful vision of a much better way of sharing tasks with one another than sending emails. And in one sense, it worked. We solved the problem we set out to solve. We built a better inbox than email. But only then did we begin to realize that unless the entire world switched, the best that we were going to be able to do was to create 2 inboxes for people to deal with. Because even though you and your spouse or partner or business team might be using something like Orchestra to share tasks in one context, the emails were still coming in. I remember one day I got an email from my wife about a set of toys we were thinking about buying for my son. And it was this horrible feeling of realizing here is someone who is probably motivated more than anyone else in the world not to send me an email. First of all, her financial future is wrapped up in mine, which is wrapped up in this startup succeeding. Second of all, she wants my opinion, and she knows if she sends me a task in Orchestra, it's going to get done.
Did you respond and ask her to send you a task?
Well, we had a really nice feature, which was if you forwarded an email to tasks at Orchestra, we would transform that email thread into a task with all these chat bubbles. It was beautiful. It worked very well. I was on a new phone, though, and I was walking down the street going to meet another entrepreneur for coffee or something, and I'm with one hand trying to hit the forward button and start typing tasks at orchestra.com, and I realized about 2 blocks down that I had to tap 20 or 25 different buttons on my phone to improve my experience. It wasn't improved at all. And it was this realization that we were just going about this the wrong way. And I remember coming back after coffee and literally lying flat on the carpet in our office with most of the team wondering what the hell I was doing.
Face down or face up?
Face up, looking like this. Just thinking, oh my God, we're never going to get there. This isn't going to work. And it was this moment of realizing, pardon my French, but shit. If we're really going to do this, we got to back all the way up. We have to back away from the to-do list, from the brand, from the story, from the product that everybody's been talking about in the App Store. We have to start over at 0. Well, maybe not 0, but pretty darn close. Inbox 0. Yeah.
Nice. Now I know where that came from.
Tech humor.
That I definitely know that feeling.
Yeah, it's a scary, scary thing. And there's this, again, it's that same kind of commitment. You realize, well, it's going to be a lot of work, and we still may fail, but the alternative is just to go ahead and accept failure now. And we weren't really willing to do that, so we backed up, had a lot of tough conversations with our investors, a lot of tough conversations with our team. Back then, email was not something that you went anywhere near if you wanted any chance of getting funding or any. It was considered this old, stodgy world that had no place in the new startup era. And every single one of our investors at first told us we were crazy. But there was this sense in which we knew the problem we had gone out to solve, and we had walked through the mistakes that had led us to an undeniable conclusion. And I think that's what gave us the courage to say, well, we may very well fail, but we don't have any other choice anymore, so we're going to try anyway.
You sort of created that entire wave of hype around email, didn't you?
I think we were on the front edge of it, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so let's go into product a bit.
Okay.
After realizing, lying flat, whatever, how did you go about figuring out what you actually wanted to build this time? What was the process?
Well, we stayed with the need, that feeling of being overwhelmed by mail, and we started looking at why it was getting worse. And it was a couple of things. On the one hand, the number of emails that anyone, particularly a professional, a knowledge worker, was getting was increasing year over year and had been ever since email's inception. So our inboxes were getting busier. And on the other, we were all carrying around these new little computers in our pockets. And for the first time, we were checking mail while waiting for a bus or waiting for coffee or walking down the street or when we should have been talking to our friend at dinner. But mostly what had happened is these big, complicated desktop experiences had been kind of mashed into this little phone screen. And people had tried to take all the functionality that they had grown to expect from using email on their computers and try and replicate that on a little screen, which doesn't work very well. From a design perspective, that's an opportunity. You have a mismatch between the devices and also between what people are trying to do and what's out there, the tools that are available. We started looking more closely at how people were using mail on their phones, and we saw a lot of behaviors that were really what we called triage. You have just a moment here or there, and you're really trying to make decisions very quickly about what's new in your inbox. You're trying to decide if something can just be ignored forever, if you can quickly respond to it, maybe with a couple of keystrokes, or if you need to get back to it when you have more time. And so we realized the opportunity was to rethink the inbox for this new context, for a new environment, a new paradigm, if you will. And that's kind of where we stuck our anchor, that what people wanted from the experience on the phone was different than what they wanted on the desktop, and that there was both design and technology constraints that were making that difficult. The protocols for checking email, for example, are quite slow. You have to talk back and forth to a server many, many times to pull down a full inbox, and that slows the process down, but you only have a second on your phone. You want it to be fast. So we created a system where the mail would be checked for you on the cloud, compressed as small as possible into one little package. You could open the phone, and this was before background sync, so this was pretty important. The system could just hand you everything at once very quickly, and you could get about your business of making those decisions. And then using swipes, which hadn't really been done in that context before. It certainly wasn't something we invented. It was just the application of other people's ideas into that context. We were able to create quick, delightful gestures. And in general, we tried to create an experience where you felt this kind of this lightness and this sense of regaining control over something that for so many people had just been a source of frustration. And I think that's really what the key was in terms of why the product began to resonate. We created a video ahead of the product that showed what the experience of using Mailbox was supposed to be like. The idea being that if you can create an emotional connection with the viewer, they're going to want the product that they see because they're going to want to feel that over their own inbox. You set up something familiar. This is email on my phone. I've seen that before. That sucks. You create a new experience. You say, it doesn't have to suck. And you leave them at the end saying, this could be your experience. That's a moment where it leaves you kind of on the edge of your seat, maybe a little bit. You're hungry to have that moment. We put the video out a little bit ahead of the product launch. Turned out to be a little more than we thought because it sort of went more explosive than we thought. We had to go build some extra systems to handle the anticipated load. But the idea was to have enough room in front of that product launch that the person who wanted that experience wouldn't be able to go to the App Store right away. And instead, they might share the video on social media. They might say, I want this. How do I get this? Have you seen this? There's been a lot of studies that show that what makes a video viral is the evoking of any emotion in someone. Anger, joy, excitement, craving, humor.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you pull an emotion out, people will take that video and they'll spread it. And so we figured we'd create an environment where there was some time for that to happen, and then we could unleash all those people on the App Store at once with the hopes that that might also increase a bit of early traction because of the way the rankings work in the App Store.
How did you handle pivoting your team?
It's a great question. You know, when you're leading a company, your job is to be the person who everyone else trusts. And fundamentally, what I needed to do in order to help the team turn was to communicate that there were a series of assumptions that I had made early on that were wrong. I think the one thing that we had in our favor is that every single person that we brought in, we told from the start that we were going to be running the startup as a design process, that we were going to be subscribing to that idea, that we were going to fail early and often to succeed faster. We made no illusions about getting it right the first time. And in fact, whether it was design or engineering, we set this expectation that 95% of your work was going to be lost. That in fact, the only thing you could reliably count on was iteration. And that we would iterate and iterate and iterate, each time learning what we had had wrong the time before, so that we could quickly adapt and try again. So the narrative was already there for us. It was not fundamentally wrong, thankfully, for me to go up to my team and say, hey, I made a pretty bad mistake early in assuming that we could build a new kind of inbox, when the problem we're trying to solve is connected to the one people are using already. Having said that, the amount of work that was going to be required to back up and start over was very painful. And the early reception of our product was quite positive. So there was an assumption on the team that we were also risking throwing away something that was really good. And that kind of conviction is really, I think, the responsibility of a leader. You get to these moments where you don't know for sure that you're making the right decision, and you have to kind of lean on your instinct and on your gut. And fortunately, it worked out well. I don't know if they would have pivoted with me a second time.
Did you do it gradually, or did you just rip the Band-Aid and said, we're starting over tomorrow?
You can't really do something like that gradually. You can have the conversations in terms of concentric circles, and that works well. Bringing the people who trust you the most and maybe who are the closest to leadership. I think we were about 14 or 15 people at that point in time, maybe a little bit less. But of course, some of those people had been there longer. They were more intimately connected, and they were in positions of more leadership. And you want to sort of help explain and build some camaraderie around that tighter circle first, so that circle can go to the larger team. In general, I think that sort of concentric circle model helps a lot in comparison to sort of just walking in one day and throwing a shit sandwich at people and saying, eat. It's not going to really work very well.
I like that metaphor. The one thing I wanted to ask about product that I forgot to mention is, how did you think about testing? Did you bring actual humans into the office and make them test?
With software, it's nice. You don't necessarily need to bring people into the office to test. You just need to bring their phones into your world. And things like Test Flight and Rink, the hockey app, and I'm sure there's other ones now as well, are really effective mechanisms for creating small networks of people that can help you try out your ideas. Obviously, it helps dramatically if they are your target market, and in particular, if you're designing something that's not for engineering-savvy knowledge workers that spend all their day sitting at a computer programming, it's really, really valuable to get other people who do not inhabit your world to use your tools.
Yeah, sure.
It can be very eye-opening to the things that seem quite obvious to you. But even then, you're never going to really know until something goes more broad. You won't know the places where the system may or may not be able to handle scale, and you won't know about the added complexities of people that have lots of other things to do and couldn't care less about your product. If someone has gone to the trouble of saying, yes, I'll help you test. Yes, I'll be an early tester. I'll go through the process of setting this up. They're already weird. They're already like...
There's a bias.
Yeah, and you can learn a lot, and you should use it, but you also have to approach it with a kind of humility of understanding that most people will not care nearly as much as they do about what you're doing. So unless they are ravishing it, unless they really like it, you're not there.
But I guess, so you said that you had made a bunch of assumptions, right, that were wrong about orchestra. How did you make sure that this time every assumption you'd make would be correct?
Right. You can't. That is the adventure of entrepreneurship, and to a certain extent the adventure of design. I mean,
you can get close. I mean, don't leave these people without a hope.
I mean, wherever...
You just said it's not about luck, it's about...
Wherever you can test. Well, it's funny. Right now in our dominant culture, we have the concept of luck and we have the concept of testing. We don't talk much about the concept of intuition. I think that's actually a mistake. Artists and designers, they have a gut sense for something.
Also normal people too,
Well, we're all artists and designers, I think, at some level. It's about whether or not we can connect with it. That sense is about... well, the best way I like to think about it is if I were to throw you a ball right now, or maybe I'll just throw you this cap, see if you can... You did trigonometry in your head there that was, from a scientific perspective, unbelievable. Your mind went and calculated the arc of that cap flying through the air. You moved your hand to just the place where it needed to be when it finally hit, and those two things connected. And you did it without thinking. Our minds are incredible, and their ability to process huge amounts of information across certain contexts are remarkable. If you were to think, if you were to stop and think about where that cap was going to be and to engage your rational mind, it would hit the ground long before you began the process of making the same sorts of decisions. And in the same way, particularly when you're in something as time urgent as a startup, to be able to rely on intuition, I believe, is essential. There's only going to be a very small subset of all the assumptions you're going to make that you're actually going to be able to test. That's just the reality of the situation you're walking into. Wherever you can, obviously you should. And one of the other things that was baked into us deeply at IDEO is that your intuition is only as good as your empathy. That is, if you don't deeply, personally understand the problem you're trying to solve, you shouldn't even bother starting, because your intuition's going to be just wrong. So you have to get into a place where you really feel the pain that you want to go away. It's yours. You understand it at this deep personal level, even if it wasn't yours before the process began. Spend time with your customers or your would-be users. Become one of them, not just because you ask them some questions, but literally become one of them. And then from that place, your hand will know where to go. I guess is the best thing I can say.
Nice. Okay, last question before we open it up for everyone else to ask you questions. Why did you decide to sell?
Why did we decide to sell? That's a great question.
Thank you.
There were two reasons. I'd say one was strategic and one was personal. The strategic one was that the space that we were in, we knew was very competitive. That getting people to use the app on its own was going to be much easier than finding a way to monetize it. And that while that point of entry into a workflow is very valuable, the people who use Mailbox use it a lot. They live out of it. And from just a user acquisition perspective, that's a really valuable asset. Trying to get them to sort of pull out their credit card and pay you, it felt like it was going to be very difficult. So that sort of product becomes really most effective when it's connected to a broader ecosystem. So by connecting to Dropbox, which itself is a company that's really focused on productivity and helping people take the friction and pain out of the work that they do every day, there was a natural synergy there that made a lot of sense. And a lot of times when you're an entrepreneur, you're looking for the places where what you're doing slots in with the world. You're looking for this kind of relevance. And sometimes that manifests in terms of business decisions, like whether or not to sell to an acquirer. We were at a point where we had multiple VCs ready to do a Series B, and we had multiple companies ready to make an acquisition. So we literally could have done anything, and it seemed to us that that was the best way to slot what we had built into a world that it had the best chance of being successful. So that was the strategic decision. The other one, though, was that this was my first time doing something like this. I had done a couple of smaller companies with friends, but without VC money, without the rocket ship kind of experience that really doing a startup is. And both my co-founder and I were very tired. At this point, I had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I felt like I never saw them. And my life was entirely subsumed by fear of death, basically. It's what kind of carries.
Fear of death?
It's what carries you in a startup. You don't know if your startup's going to live or die.
Oh, not of your death.
Not my death.
Okay.
No. My startup stuff. Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting segue into a different conversation.
The opportunity to take advantage of a lot of infrastructure that a larger company had built, and to become part of that entity, and not have to have so many things resting on our shoulders as founders was very appealing. I think it's maybe Mark Andreessen, I'm not sure, who said that founders don't run out of money, they run out of energy. I think that's often the case. Not always, it assumes a perfect market, but it can be very easy to get worn out if you're not careful, and we were pretty tired.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
So let's open it up for questions. We have about 9 minutes left. I can't really see anyone because I'm being blinded by a light. But okay, now I see someone there. Let's do it. Could you also quickly say what you do and your name? Could you also get up? Thanks. You could also tell me the question.
Hello?
I can repeat. Okay.
Right. So I'm Gabriel Radik. I'm a product manager at a startup in Berlin. My question to you would be, how do you react? How do you pivot your product when you have inbox from Gmail coming up and doing a pretty nice job at it?
Yeah.
And second is not a question, just please fix the Mac version.
What was this?
Fix the Mac version of Mailbox.
Yeah.
Please do it.
I'm going to leave that second one right where it is, because I also am a little bit frustrated about that. The first question, how did we react to Inbox by Google?
I remember your Facebook post.
Yeah. So it's funny, you have to think about that from two angles. From a business perspective, you have this moment of seeing realized one of the things that we were concerned about from the start, which is that interface design is a difficult thing to retain as a competitive advantage. It's not defensible. We built patents for a lot of the things that we created, but defending those patents is incredibly complicated, and apart from that, there's really nothing. So we knew, and one of the reasons that I was talking about the business difficulty of continuing to take this product on its own, we knew that from a pure business standpoint, this was always a vulnerability, that we had built something on top of largely Google's platform that was a new way of experiencing it, but was not in and of itself defensible. And so in that sense, you have this proof, and it's this kind of heavy moment of, But the overwhelming feeling for me, to be very honest, was actually one of excitement. And the reason for that is because fundamentally, if you go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, fundamentally, I'm motivated by the idea of making the world a better place, of taking problems that are frustrating and making them go away. And I think entrepreneurship at its best, when it's most effective, is motivated in that way. And what we saw, and what I hope to continue to leverage as I go forward in my career, is that if you are truly innovative and you create things that are better, big companies that may have more difficulty innovating on their own will take notice, and they will replicate those things. And then whether someone uses your product or your competitor's product, everyone's in a better state. And that's not necessarily a given in our world. If you think about the period, for example, between like the Mac and when Steve Jobs came back in the late 90s, you could have any computer you wanted as long as it was a gray box with a Dell sign on it running Windows 95. And it sucked. But that was it. That was the only game in town. There was a monopoly over that part of the ecosystem, and that's all that could happen. Those sorts of stagnations of innovation are really detrimental to us as a species. And the more that any of us can do to shake that up, to create disruptive moments, whether or not we can hold on to them in some sort of personal way is kind of irrelevant on the grand scheme. We get to play this part in actually taking the human endeavor in moving it forward. So I had a kind of pride that day that Google had taken an army of 200 people and were marching behind us. That felt kind of nice.
Behind us.
Well, yeah, they were
Nice.
catching up.
Yeah, makes sense. Who else? There's someone up there.
Hello.
I think you need a mic. Yeah.
Can I ask if I have the mic?
Wait, there's someone else with a
Oh.
mic.
Okay, is this working?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's hard to see you, sorry.
No worries.
You guys
I'll ask
decide who's going to be
afterwards.
first.
Okay, so I'll go first. So let's assume you have a new idea, leaving Mailbox behind. What
Okay.
would you do? No money, no VC, no press.
Well,
Did you understand?
yeah, what would you do if you had a new idea? Me in particular or an entrepreneur?
You in particular.
Wait, what would you do if you had a new idea with no money and no press?
Yeah, how would you go about launching your startup if there would be no VC, no press, no TechCrunch, no nothing?
I'm assuming you're referring to having an idea in Cluj, right?
It's kind of similar.
It's funny. I think there are a lot of benefits to taking venture capital, but there are downsides as well. And there's a lot of benefits to press, but there are downsides as well. There are a lot of benefits to customers, but there are certainly downsides as well. If you think about that process we were talking about of iterating on your idea, you start with this naive assumption that you can make something great, and it's exciting enough you want to go after it. It's still going to be a long process of failure before you get to a place where it actually works, where you've found the spots where your assumptions were wrong and you've replaced them with better assumptions. And what you want to do is reduce that cost as much as possible. And one of the best ways to do that is to keep as few cooks in the kitchen as you can. So I think the best answer to your question is I would pull together a very small team of people that I deeply trusted and where we could work together in highly iterative ways to make lots and lots and lots of prototypes, to build, try, improve, build, try, improve, and to do so as quietly and as intimately as possible, to create a kind of incubator for ourselves, a kind of nest where that idea could have its early stages of gestation and growth until it got to a place where it was really working. And the time to go get money is when something's starting to kind of like get away from you and you've got more demand than you know how to handle. And that's a good time because then you have much more control over the situation. You don't have to convince the investor of what you're doing. You're in a bit more of a driver's seat. So the more that you can reduce the need for outside capital and keep the team small, keep everybody else's eyes and opinions away as you're doing that early iteration to lower the cost, that's what I think is the most valuable thing for those early stages.
Thank you.
So can you give us an idea of when Mailbox will be supporting Exchange and IMAP?
That's a great question. I can't speak to it, though, unfortunately.
Next. Anyone else? I can't really see, so. Oh, okay. Cool. Well, I think I've done a good job.
I'll have one closing question to you, if I may. I have
Do
my own
it.
microphone, so I'm privileged with that. The closing question is, what do we need to do to, because you're coming from the outside, what would we need to do to get you engaged in the Cluj ecosystem? Because Anna said earlier she doesn't want to share you, so that's why I'm asking you directly.
I just hope that they were not necessarily my words.
Well, I'm here right now. Grab me at the end of the meeting. If you've got an idea, let's chat.
So what would you be excited? I mean, in the audience, who should connect with you and what should they pitch you?
I think the right answer is ask Ganda for permission.
Find me. Let's chat.
Okay. Then
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Much
Thank you.
appreciated.